Hi, so this video is devoted to rational expectations hypothesis and how it changes the entire analysis under three-equation model. So before we proceed, I would like to discuss briefly the notion of uncertainty versus the idea behind risk. So risk is predictable, measurable, and quite often manageable. So if we discuss risk, we assume that agents know all the possible options, all the possible outcomes, as well as probabilities assigned to these outcomes. So even though they are not sure about the actual outcome, they know its probability. And uncertainty, or radical uncertainty under Keynesian terminology, is associated with some outcomes which cannot be anticipated. So there is a lot of literature about uncertainty, and most of it was published after the recent global financial crisis, which was all about uncertainty. So something which wasn't anticipated even by the central banks and the best world economists actually happened in reality. So there are two possible sources of uncertainty, they are discussed in the literature. So some scholars argue that uncertainty arises from our limited cognitive capacity. So actually everything in the world is fully deterministic. Everything can be predicted. We are just unable to do so because we are not intelligent enough and we do not have enough information. And others argue that uncertainty arises from non-ergodic structure of the world. So it's not about us, it's just some fundamental feature of the reality. So not everything can be anticipated simply because I'm not sure how to explain the term ergodicity in very simple terms. But basically, ergodicity means that you can derive some expectations, rational expectations about the future, based on what you observe in the past. Like you derive your knowledge of probability based on something which has already occurred. And non-ergodicity hypothesis tells you that in some cases you are able to do this efficiently, and in some cases it's simply impossible to do. But not because you're not intelligent enough, but because, structure of the world is such. However, this is not relevant to the core topic, I just wanted to introduce it. So, actually, even though central banks have quite a good access to information and they try to make rational predictions about the future, not always they are able to do so. Just because not everything is about risk, but something is also about uncertainty. Not every event can be predicted, like it was during the recent financial crisis. Okay, so talking about inflationary expectations, in general form they can be denoted like this. So this is expected value of inflation conditional to informational set, and this is how we denote it. So this is expected rate of inflation in period t, depending on information agents dispose in the previous period, like what they observe in the previous period. So depending on the nature of this informational set, we distinguish between adaptive inflationary expectations and rational inflationary expectations. So under adaptive inflationary expectations, as we discussed before, agents formulate their expectations based on observing the past. So simply, I assume that in 2021 the rate of inflation will be the same as in 2020. As simple as it is. So in case of adaptive inflationary expectations, this information set includes solely the rate of inflation in the previous period. When it comes to rational inflationary expectations, this informational set includes all the available information. Like, for instance, past behavior of the central bank, reliability of the central bank, credibility of central bank's promises, and so on and so forth. So yeah, agents with rational inflationary expectations are forward-looking, and they use all the available information in order to shape their expectations. Also, rationality of inflationary expectations implies no systematic errors. So systematic error is something we discussed in the second topic when we proceeded to analysis of Phillips curves. So as you remember, if there is an inflationary gap, then during each period inflation will increase further and further because agents have systematically wrong inflationary expectations. So they always assume that inflation will be the same as in the previous period, and it's always different, in fact. So again, this is the thing under adaptive inflationary expectations, but not under rational inflationary expectations. Okay, so depending on the type of expectations we assume, we will distinguish between two different forms of Phillips curve. So this one should be very familiar to you. So we assume that the rate of inflation is shaped by the output gap times alpha, which stands for sensitivity of wages required by workers to the size of the output gap, plus expected rate of inflation. And in our case, expected rate of inflation in period t is equal to the rate of inflation in the previous period, or period t minus 1. Under rational inflationary expectations, we assume that expected rate of inflation is identical to the actual rate of inflation. So if agents are perfectly rational and they use all the available information, they are actually able to predict the rate of inflation with a high precision. And when I mean high precision, I mean that still we have to introduce this error term. So error term, or stochastic term, stands for some random deviation between the actual rate of inflation and expected rate of inflation. We assume it to be relatively small, and we assume it to be represented by the white noise pattern. So there are relatively small deviations, some of them are positive, some of them are negative, but the mean of error term is expected to be equal to 0. So then, if you assume that those two are equal, we can just cancel them out, and as the result you get this equation. So level of output should be equal to potential output plus error term divided by alpha. But of course this is valid only if you assume rational inflationary expectations. We will get back to implications of this in a moment. So here, let us analyze the process of adjustment to the change in inflationary target under rational expectations and adaptive expectations. So first, let's start with something familiar, namely adaptive expectations. So the idea is like this. The central bank, now it's fine. So the central bank decided to decrease the target level of inflation from pi tau 0 to pi tau 1. It has nothing to do with Phillips curve, because Phillips curve is not affected by the target level of inflation. It will just affect the shape of the monetary rule line. And if you look in the equation of monetary rule, you will easily find out that decrease in the target level of inflation will cause the parallel downward shift of the monetary rule line. So we have this shift, and of course it's impossible to move from this point to this point immediately because central bank is constrained by the Phillips curve. So monetary rules shifted down, and we are still on the same Phillips curve because here everything happens within the same period. So we have a new intercept of Phillips curve and new monetary rule. And this will be pi 1, or inflation, with which we end up this first period after introducing the new target level of inflation. So this level of inflation is higher than expected level of inflation in the previous period. And as usual, in this case, we have downward shift of Phillips curve in the next period. So here we have it. Again, we end up with the smaller rate of inflation. So basically, the process of adjustment will continue until finally we reach this point with the new target level of inflation. So nevertheless, it will take some time, and here disinflation will imply some cost for the economy. So take a look. If we move from this point to this point, we actually move to the point with smaller inflation, smaller output, and higher level of unemployment. However, if we assume rational expectations, everything will happen within one period. So it will be enough for the central bank to announce that there is a new inflation target, and rational agents, keeping in mind that sooner or later economy will arrive at this point, because they are rational, they are able to do this analysis as we discuss here. They are able to perform this analysis as we discuss it here. So actually in the next period, Phillips curve will shift down, and we just move from this point to this point. So keep in mind, in this case, there is no decrease in terms of output in short run. So disinflation, because that's how we call the decrease in the target level of inflation, or disinflation. Disinflation is costly in terms it increases unemployment under adaptive expectations, but it's not associated with any additional cost for an economy under rational expectations. Of course, it will work only if agents are indeed rational and if they have some reasons to believe central bank promises. So in this case, it will work. Otherwise, not really. Okay, so as I promised, when it comes to output gap under inflationary expectations. So you remember we discussed this, that under rational expectations, rate of inflation has to be equal to the expected rate of inflation. So in fact, those two are cancelled out. And in this case, level of output has to be equal to the potential level of output. And it should always be like this under rational expectations. So this is actually error term. That's why we have to introduce it for the sake of reliability. I mean, for bigger empirical validity of the model, but it's possible to neglect it in theoretical analysis. So that's how it should be. So under rational expectations, the only condition for having the rate of inflation below infinitely big value is to have output gap closed. So if there is a positive output gap, then inflation will achieve infinitely big positive value. If it's negative, inflation will achieve infinitely big negative value. So yeah. Again, you can try to prove it yourself. Okay, so under three-equation model, so rational expectations hypothesis will transform three-equation model slightly. So in this case, we assume that there is no time lag in terms of interest rate and output. So if we assume that firms and households are rational and forward-looking, they would anticipate possible change in interest rate and adjust in advance. So there would be no time lag. When it comes to Phillips curve, we assume that expected rate of inflation is equal to pi tau, or target level of inflation, because as we discussed before, this is when economy will end up sooner or later. So rational expectations imply that agents keep this in mind, so they are able to predict actions of the central bank. And analogously, we have new monetary rule, which is basically the same. The only difference is that actual rate of inflation will not be affected by inflation in the previous period, but expectations about inflation formulated by rational agents. Okay, so before here we discussed two cases when expectations are rational and central bank is credible, and the case when agents formulate their inflationary expectations based on what they observe in the past. However, it's always possible to have something in between. So in this case, chi denotes central bank's credibility, and basically we can describe it as the weight assigned to target level of inflation in formulating inflationary expectations. So this is expected rate of inflation. It's equal to pi tau for rational agents, and it's equal to pi t minus 1 for backward-looking agents. And basically here we have some average, like weighted average value, which again depends on the value of chi or central bank's credibility. Okay, so if we analyze inflationary shock under totally backward-looking expectations, it should be very familiar to you. I just inserted here for the sake of revision. Actually pi tau should be here. Okay, so as you remember, we have some inflationary shock in period 0. So then, since we end up period 1 with this rate of inflation, we can predict the level of inflation in the next period. So central bank knows that this will be Phillips curve in period 1, and it adjusts interest rate accordingly. And since here inflation is lower than in the previous period, Phillips curve will shift down and down and down until economy reaches the initial point of equilibrium. But again, in this case, as I mentioned before, disinflation will be costly because we will actually have initial decrease in the level of output in period 1. So when it comes to inflationary shock consequences under firmly anchored expectations, so basically expectations when the value of chi is equal to 1, so central bank's promise is 100% credible, and agents assign no weight to the past level of inflation when formulating their inflationary expectations. As I mentioned before, it will take exactly 1 period to adjust. So we move to the point with higher inflation, but then agents realize that something is out of equilibrium, and in the next period they just adapt their inflationary expectations accordingly. So in this case, there is no cost associated with disinflation because there is no change in the level of output. And finally, if we assume that inflationary expectations are partially anchored, so let's say chi is equal to 0.5, so we assign equal weights to the target level of inflation and level of inflation in the previous period when formulating inflationary expectations, then it will look somehow like this. So economy will adjust quicker in comparison to fully backward-looking expectations, but in contrast to perfectly rational expectations, it will still take some time. Okay, and now let us assume that central authorities decided to manipulate the level of output, I don't know, because of upcoming elections or anything like this, by using monetary policy. You might say that usually central banks are independent from government, and I would totally agree. And actually, this example illustrates why central banks should be independent from government. Okay, so basically what I mentioned, that central authorities would like to achieve higher level of output by the means of monetary policy, implies that central bank changes its output target. So now, instead of loss minimizing level of output equal to potential output, we assume it to be equal to YH. So basically it means that central authorities would like to move from this point, point of initial equilibrium, to the point of new equilibrium with the same level of inflation but higher level of output. However, it will not work. It will not work because rational wage setters or even irrational wage setters would formulate their expectations depending on the actual size of output gap. The difference between YT and potential output, not target level of output. New target level of output. So let's analyze it step by step. So if we have new higher target level of output, we have new monetary rule line. And again, if you check the equation for monetary rule, you will see that increase in the target level of output, replacing YE with YH, when YH has a bigger value, is associated with parallel upward shift of the monetary rule line. And as you remember, central bank is constrained by the shape of Phillips curve. So actually it's impossible to be located at this point because there is no intercept with Phillips curve. Instead, we will move to this point. So that's why it's denoted in gray. It's something desirable, yet not fully achievable for the central authorities. So we move from this point to this point. We end up the period with the higher level of inflation. That's why in the next period, Phillips curve will shift up and up until we end up at this point. So at this point we have the same level of output, however we have higher level of inflation. So take a look, actually it's quite interesting. So central authorities wanted to have the same level of inflation but bigger level of output, but in fact we end up with the same level of output but bigger level of inflation. And actually when you calculate this, this is exactly the value of the inflation bias. So inflation bias is, so we use the term inflation bias in order to denote increase in inflation in equilibrium resulting from the increase in the target level of output. Okay, and probably, I will get back to this exactly in one slide, but keep in mind that inflationary expectations of wage setters do not depend on potential output, to output targeted by the central authorities, but on potential output. Because potential output actually describes true production capacities of the economy. So if output is bigger than potential output, then there will be always negative cyclical unemployment, and the pressure, upward pressure on wages will be persistent. Okay, so let's do it more formally. Okay, so this is loss function of the central bank, and we replace YE with YH, assuming that now central bank has a new target and YH is bigger than YE. And as usual, central bank minimizes losses subject to the Phillips curve. And here you have the Phillips curve. So in this case, if we assume, okay, not at this point. So for the central bank, losses minimization condition implies equalizing slopes of the loss curve to the slope of Phillips curve. And we can solve it using implicit function theorem, as we did before in the video deriving the monetary rule line. Here you have it. Here you have it. And by doing some very simple calculations, this is what you end up with. So finally, we have to recall that in equilibrium, the value of output should be equal to the value of potential output. So like this is the only condition to have no upward pressure on inflation. Because when we have this upward pressure, by definition, this is not an equilibrium. Equilibrium is a situation when there is no internal pressure to change any of the variables. So in order to avoid this pressure, we have to equalize the value of output to the value of potential output, basically replacing YT with YE, and that's what we have as the final result. So take a look. If central bank attempts to minimize its losses, this is the level of inflation we will end up with. So again, it's not pi tau, which would happen if we still have YE or potential output as the target level of output. Instead, we have it here. And again, this is the size of the inflationary bias or inflation bias. Like the difference between actual rate of inflation and target level of inflation resulting from the attempt of central authorities to use monetary policy for the sake of manipulating output. So, just to summarize this idea, if central bank targets potential output and target level of inflation, then central bank actually ends up with potential output and target level of inflation. If central bank attempts to target level of inflation, pi tau, like loss minimizing level of inflation, and YH, some level of output which is above the potential output, then in line with what we discuss here, central bank will still end up with potential output and higher level of inflation. I mean level of inflation above the target loss minimizing level of inflation. So actually by attempting to target higher level of output, central bank is even worse off than when it tries to target lower level of output as long as it's equal to potential output. So basically that's why manipulating monetary policy for the sake of achieving higher level of output does not work. And if this idea sounds very complicated to you, then you can just recall AS-AD model we analyzed during introductory macroeconomics course. So when each time we have increase in aggregate demand, price level increases, and there is an equilibrium with the same potential level of output but higher price level. So here it's just described in a more complicated way. But the idea is very trivial, Potential output, level of output in the long run perspective depends on technologies, production capacities, and other factors, not monetary policy and not fiscal policy. Yeah, to say it more formally, in long run, equilibrium can be increased by the means of supply side policy, not demand side policy. Okay, so there are some tasks for you. You have to draw the impulse response functions for output, inflation, and real interest rate following inflation shock under 3 sets of assumptions. So first, assume that inflationary expectations are fully backward looking. Again, we did it before, it's just a kind of revision. B, inflation expectations are firmly anchored to the inflation target. So basically this is a situation in which the value of chi is equal to 1 and we totally neglect inflation in the previous period. And finally, inflationary expectations are partially anchored to the inflation target. You have all the graphs in this video before. So if you'd like to practice, you can put this video on hold and try to solve it, and I will just proceed with solution and explanation. Okay, so in the first case, when we have fully backward-looking inflationary expectations, or basically adaptive inflationary expectations, that's how it looks like. So we have some increase in inflation in period 0, as you can see it here, and then it will slowly decrease until it reaches the initial level of equilibrium, or the level of medium run equilibrium, or pi tau. Actually, it's not fully visible. Yeah, now it's better. Or pi tau. When it comes to output, like first we have sharp decrease in output in period 1, and then it will decrease until it reaches medium run equilibrium, or the level of potential output. For interest rate, we have sharp increase in interest rate in period 0, and then it decreases until it reaches its initial level. Okay, so when it comes to perfectly anchored expectations, or firmly anchored expectations, anchored, whatever, you've got the idea. So as I discussed before, it will take exactly one period. It will take an economy exactly one period to adjust. So basically we have increase in inflation in period 0, and then in period 1 it decreases to the initial level of the target level of inflation. There is no change in output, there is no change in interest rate. Okay, so finally, when it comes to partially anchored, whatever, expectations, it will look kind of similar to point A. The only difference is that we have smaller initial decrease in the level of output and smaller initial increase in the level of interest rate. Because again, in the next period, we will have bigger shift when it comes to Phillips curve. So economy will adjust. So it will take less time of the economy to reach the initial equilibrium. Okay, task 2. Assume that economy is in equilibrium with target level of inflation equal to 2%. Assume that inflationary gap, which is equal 4%, is created. For the sake of simplicity, assume that both alpha and beta are equal to 1. So basically, banks are neutral, neither inflation averse, neither unemployment averse, and sensitivity of like wage setters to output gap is equal to 1. Sensitivity is equal to 1. Okay, whatever. Expectations are partially anchored with chi equal to 0.6. So you have to calculate the increase in inflation in period 1 and period 2. You have to answer point A, assuming that expectations are fully backward looking, so chi is equal to 0. And you have to derive some conclusion about systematic biases made by agents under different assumptions about expectations. Again, if you'd like to practice, please put this video on hold. This is the solution. So if chi equal to 0.6, basically your task is just to put this value to the value of inflation. And here you have it. So it will be equal to 6% in the first period and 7.6% in the second period. Because in this case, again, instead of pi t minus 1, I put 2%. Like this was initial target level of inflation, or expected level of inflation before the inflationary gap was created. And here I just take value from the previous period. Here, 6%, 6. Because pi 1 is equal to pi t minus 1 in period 2. Okay, when it comes to fully backward-looking expectations, it's even easier. So then I assume that the value of chi is equal to 0. So there is 0 weight assigned to the target level of inflation. And I end up with level of inflation equal to 6 in the first period and level of inflation equal to 10 in the second period. So in case of adaptive inflationary expectations, inflation will increase faster than in case of partially rational expectations. However, in both cases, inflation will increase until the output gap, or inflationary gap to be more specific, is closed. Okay, third task. So here you have to say whether the statement is true or false, and you have to explain your opinion. So S1. Better communication by central banks can influence the path the economy takes after an economic shock. The second statement, S2. Better communication by central bank does not affect how economic agents react to interest rate changes, and basically, since interest rate is the main tool used by monetary policy makers to achieve their inflation target, it also implies that better communication by central bank does not affect the path economy takes after an economic shock. So basically here you can see some contradictions between those two statements. So here you have a hint. One of them has to be wrong. They cannot be true at the same time. Again, if you'd like to take some time and overthink this, put this video on hold, and here is the correct answer. Okay, so the first statement is true, because central bank's credibility affects rational agents' expectations, and it also affects the shape of Phillips curve, and it affects the path of adjustment. So I will just recall this graph here. So here we assume that agents are forward-looking and central bank's promises to maintain the target level of inflation are 100% credible. So in this case, economy will adjust to the change immediately, and there will be no cost associated with disinflation. And again, this is possible only when central bank is A, credible, so agents actually find promises made by central bank pretty reliable, and B, central bank announces its attempt to decrease target level of inflation publicly. So yeah, central bank communication will be a game changer in this case. Okay, the second statement is false, because if we assume that agents are rational and central bank is credible, stabilization occurs automatically and there is no lag in the IS curve. But again, it will occur only when central bank is credible and only when central bank publicly announces its attempts regarding introducing any changes in the monetary policy path. So what I mean is that stabilization can occur automatically, but this is possible only when rational agents are aware about central bank's intentions. So that's why this statement is false. Okay, the fourth task. Imagine that government can exert control over monetary policy, which usually does not happen because government is separated from the central bank, but nevertheless. So what happens under adaptive inflationary expectations when the government targets a level of output above equilibrium? Either a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and point B, how about rational expectations? If you'd like to solve this, please put video on hold. So this is solution to 4a. It's very similar. Like basically this is the same graph we used for describing inflation bias. And the answer is yes, there will be a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So to be more precise, exactly in this period. So in the first period after this change was introduced, like after monetary rule curve shifted up, we have bigger level of output corresponding to the smaller level of unemployment and bigger level of inflation. However, when economy reaches its medium run equilibrium with level of output equal to potential output, this will be undermined. So that's why there is no long run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Only short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment is actually possible. And if we assume that agents are rational and forward-looking, there will be no short-run trade-off. So basically, agents will make all of those complicated calculations we did before. So they will find out that economy will end up with this level of inflation, and they will quickly adjust their expectations. So we just move to the upper Phillips curve and to the new level of equilibrium. So instead of moving to the point with smaller unemployment and bigger inflation, and then to the point with the same output and bigger inflation, we immediately move from the point with the same level of output. We immediately move from the point pi tau ye to the point ye pi tau plus inflation bias. So in this case, there will be no even short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, so that was it when it comes to this topic, and thank you for watching.